Good afternoon, everyone. It's 2:30 Central Time and other times wherever you guys are. So welcome to our Neuroscience and Education webinar on how cognitive skills translate to biology, history, and literature. So we're going to take a look at the curriculum today. I'm Betsy Hill. I am President and Chief Operating Officer of Learning Enhancement Corporation, and it is my very great pleasure today to introduce a guest presenter. We have with us today Stacy Harris, who is founder of Creating Independent Learners. Stacy has studied exhaustively and in the areas of educational psychology and cognitive neuroscience, and she brings just a ton of expertise and experience to bear with the many students she works with. She starts with them dealing with some basic cognitive processes and then helps them develop those and translate them to the demanding tasks of understanding and mastering today's curriculum. So today she's going to actually help us see how that translation happens. I think you'll find some great tips and ideas and ways to work with your students, especially if you're using Brainware Safari, and how that translates to a whole bunch of other disciplines. So welcome, Stacy. We're so glad to have you with us today.
Thank you. And I just want to say I'm honored to be a part of Learning Enhancement Neuroscience Series. As Betsy said, I am a huge proponent of neuroscience in education. I was always a bit perplexed why it didn't exist sooner. So welcome all, and let's get started. I strongly believe that as we ask our students to know and understand, we therefore should have some basic knowledge of neurology, skills, and functioning. So I've presented some information pretty easily, I hope, for all of you, and let's get started. So, as I said, I always wondered why truly sound theories and research-demonstrated results were not incorporated into our educational system. Now it's begun. But there's a danger there. There is a plethora of books, programs, seminars, things that are called brain-based teaching, neuroscience in the classroom. You can Google it and pages will pop up. A recent learning enhancement webinar ended with the words, "Be skeptical." And I couldn't agree more. And I want to read to you a comment that came from a recent article in the New York Times that discussed software skill strengthening games. And this educator wrote, "I keep looking for good studies that show how math performance or an ability to write an essay or some other really important set of skills have been dramatically enhanced for normal kids." Now, he's referring to, it happens to be a male, skill strengthening games. So to better understand why Brainware Safari is as good as it is, it's not something you have to be skeptical about. Let's look at some of the skills that Brainware Safari targets that are underlying and critically important for academics. See if we can have the next slide. All right. These are some of the basic skills that must happen within our students in order for them to successfully be successful students. I agree with the comment, no one can replace a teacher teaching and scaffolding a student. No game is going to create a good essay. But if we have students who have weak skills, that means the responsibility of teaching and scaffolding students to create good essays is challenging. Rarely as teachers do we see the result of one area of weakness listed here. Rather, we see an overall problem. For example, reading difficulties in lower school. Are they due to visual processing, auditory processing, or phonological weaknesses, or a bit of each one? We don't know. We also see in our students a lack of executive skills. I want to say that those executive skills are the final output of the integration of what you see listed. Critical here is we always hear now about frontal lobes. Well, there's two parts of the frontal lobe that are important. One is involved in planning, one is involved in integration and planning. Therefore, if we don't have integration, we have weaknesses. If we have underlying weaknesses, we don't know as teachers in schools what those underlying problems are. We don't know if there's a core problem. That's why we can have the next slide. The evaluation of skills is done through standardized testing, and these are utilized during a neuropsychological evaluation or a educational psychological evaluation, often called the neuropsych or an ed-psych evaluations. The results of these are critical when IEPs are determined for students that we as teachers follow. Here are some examples of the diagnostic tools used within the standardized test. I won't refer to the test. They're all different, but they have similar components because they have to be validated and reliable. So this is a test obviously called arrows. The next one, geometric puzzles. Again, these aren't testing reading. These are testing underlying skills that go into how our students pay attention, receive, process, think, and their output. Now if we can have the next slide. I want you to notice this. This is obviously sky scanning, and it is from Brainware Safari. There's a similarity here between what this looks like and what those diagnostic methods look like. Sky scanning, for those of you who don't know, there are numbers that are verbally presented, and then the students have to find the numbers within the sequence of how they're presented. And you can see it's random. They're all over. It requires a number of skills, predominantly auditory memory, because you're given the words on a verbal level, visual tracking, you have to be able to find. We're going to hear more about tracking, visual discrimination, and sequenceability. Those are the things that are evaluated. Can we have the next slide? Another game is Iguana Lookout. Students here, or players, proceed row by row, left to right. You'll see there are arrows pointing certain directions, and they have to click on the bottom word that demonstrates the meaning of the arrow. This is Visuospatial, processing speed, tracking, discrimination, and association of words and a symbol. Again, what's tested during an evaluation. The next game is web weaving. In this game, you can see the 5 green dots, or circles, if you will. Each dot is lit up, and then on the right, again, will be another screen of the web and the dots, obviously without the shape, and the player has to recreate this shape. This is visual memory, this is visual spatial, this is visual tracking, visual discrimination, visual attention. Incredibly important skills. Let's go on to the next slide. Now, these skills. Executive functioning, we mentioned. Spatial processing, visual processing, auditory and language processing. Our students must first clearly receive information. That's the sensory input. They have to be able to attend, organize, and select. But it's these underlying skills that allow them to do that. The next screen, please. The next screen now shows perception. Perception is really processing. Look at what it says: process, identify, interpret. It's not a linear fashion in processing occurs, and it's not in a sequential pattern. We know there are parallel functions, and these parallel loops, if we will, give feedback to each other. When the brain, if we can have the next slide, is working together, where we have, they are, let's say, the areas of the brain, let me try and be succinct about this because it can be confusing. The areas of the brain communicate with each other. They have to give feedback to other areas. And within that communication and feedback, there are associations that have to be drawn upon, memories that have to be drawn upon, new associations, new memories, new understanding, new reasoning that's being created. Then, of course, we have the output. That would be our executive functioning. Can we have the next slide? Now, everything is lighting up. We have a student's brain that is working. They are knowing content, they are comprehending, understanding, and they are analyzing. There's logic behind it, there's reason behind it, there is purposeful, reflective thought that is going on. That is critical, and that's what we need in our students. Can we have the next slide? As educators, we want critical, inferential thinking from our students who have good executive functioning skill. Let's look at a diagram of inference. It's not mine, but I use it often. Our students, and we're going to from now on focus on visual text of any kind, but nevertheless visual text that reading is involved. So while reading, our students have to discern, find, salient, the ideas and the information within the text. In order to infer, they have to combine that with what they know, their ideas, their knowledge. They then have to make this inferential leap, we call it, and infer. But here's the catch. If they can't do number one, if they cannot find salient ideas and information, their ability to infer is automatically reduced. Can we have the next slide? So let's focus on one, find salient ideas and information, and how do we do that? First, we have to make sure our skills are there. When we read, 1 through 7 here has to be accomplished. I'm not going to say that they must be accomplished in this order, because remember, we have parallel functions. But what is key is that visual text implies visual processing. If the lines on the text, can we have the next slide, please? If the lines on the text cannot be followed from left to right, end to end, we don't have good visual tracking. Often, our eyes, all of our eyes, don't go from end to end of a text. We don't realize it. We're missing words. In missing words, we're missing information. If we can't pay attention visually, we can't stay receptive enough to the information coming in from the text. Now, let's look at visual discrimination. A student has to look at that word within and be able to see each letter and know, in fact, that that's a W and not a V, or know that an N and it's not an M. So for those of you who work with students who are dyslexic, this is a common problem. Often what we don't realize is many students have skills that are weak in visual processing. Visual tracking, visual attention, visual discrimination all go under visual processing. Can we have the next slide, please? In that case, if we have weak visual processing, words are not correctly decoded, they can't be encoded, and they cannot be understood. Phonological processing is weak. Auditory processing means that within, the student can hear, interpret the short vowel sound I correctly. They know that the TH is what we call that welded sound for some of us who know Orton Gillingham. They have to encode it. They have to put it together within. Now we need visualization. They have to be able to understand, to see one object within another. There's an associated meaning there that entails those visual spatial skills. Again, we need strong foundations. Can we have the next slide, please? Let's go back to sky scanning and visual tracking and visual attention. They're the basics. Remember, the yellow lines, dot to dot. In playing this game, if students cannot visually track well, their eye is all over the place. There's a time limit here. They will run out of time. They have to discriminate a 41 from a 48, a 14 from a, reversal, a 41 from a 14. If 14 is the target word that they have to find, but they reverse, if you go to a right angle up, you will see 41. There's an error. That's visual discrimination. Now, let's take this skill of visual tracking and visual attention and apply it to a middle school textbook. Some of these task skills that we're going to be looking at may seem to be most applicable during lower school or early middle school years. Yet I cannot tell you the number of students I see in 8th through probably 11th and even 12th grade who are weak in these skills. They're bright enough to get by, but these skills are holding them back. Visual structure, again, we want to go from left to right when they track. The next slide, please. Can we have the next slide, Sarah? When they're done, this is what the text should look like. Now, we can take this exercise and we can expand it. This is not busy work that we're having them do. This is critical skill building. It's similar to sky scanning. Can we have the next slide, please? Let's look at visual, spatial, and whole part skills of Iguana Lookout. Everything must be integrated. It's not in isolation. So can we have the next slide? Visual spatial skills don't apply only to directions, points on a map, or finding a route from one place to another. It refers to relationships of and between information. So when we talk about academic application, visual spatial skills, whole part skills, I was working with a 9th grade student, and you had to write an essay on The Great Gatsby. And his first sentence was, "This book is on people." Clearly there were a lot of writing issues, but let's focus on people. A cat is on the table. I drew this picture on the left, and then I drew the picture on the right for the student. The Great Gatsby is not on people. We could say the book The Great Gatsby is about people. Often prepositions are taught as part of grammar, but they are critical for visualization and grasping, understanding, associated meaning of words, as well as how the words to connect to each other. So frequently when you hear about reading problems, we hear, 1, it refers to decoding, 2, students don't have the vocabulary, or 3, they cannot connect the information. They can't find the story within the words. The exercises I'm going to show you help students connect. Can we have the next slide, please? This is the same passage, tracked the same way, But now students highlight prepositions, and they highlight them in the same color. Never ceases to amaze me how many high school students do not know prepositions. Can we have the next slide? After they read and they highlight, I give them a sheet of prepositional representations that they're going to have to apply to that text. Now, I include symbols that are not accurate, but nevertheless, they have to find what's right. Can we have the next slide? Now, I make them draw the symbol, appropriate symbol, over the preposition. I know technology is widely used in schools today. Kinesthetic involvement enhances learning. I either have the students draw or cut them out and paste them on. Nevertheless, we are taking a representational symbol and we are pairing that with a word. We are making an association, an experience, an understanding for students, as Iguana Lookout does. Can we have the next slide, please? The students eventually have to draw the map, the bone, I should say. But before we do that, I want to explain something. Our brains process incoming information in parallel but different areas. So you can see this, that there's the dorsal where pathway and the ventral what pathway. That means that we need to know what is the subject topic? Where is that subject topic going? Can we have the next slide, please? Blood vessels and nerves are the what. The bone is the what. The where is through the membrane. Beneath, okay, but it's beneath the bone's outer membrane. I have my what and I have my where. From this, I have students draw the bone. What's critical here is consistent color coding. So we know that long-term learning gains are best occur when we have consistency. Consistency, repetition in methodology across different domains. So here, for me, no matter what the student is doing, no matter what the subject is, subject topic is green, prepositions are turquoise. That's it. Now, please watch the students while they draw. You can pick any article you want, any passage you want. It never fails that students begin drawing the bone in a dog bone shape that you give treats in a horizontal position. That's not going to do it. Then they start tiny. That's not going to do it. These points of a student's performance are perfect to point out the importance of content within context. Wait a minute. You're going to draw vessels and nerves through the membrane, but wait a minute. There's a lot more to that membrane and a lot more happening. But if they're only focusing on one part of the text instead of the whole context, the whole gestalt, they're not going to get that. Can we have the next slide, please? The same slide, the same bone structure can be used for visual auditory integration, like sky scanning. The next slide, please. You can verbally present students with any words of your choice from any passage you want, and you can tell them, highlight only in the order I give you. Now, here, the words of and to are presented, and they can only highlight in that order. Doesn't matter how many other times they see the word of or to, it's got to be in that order. Now we're reinforcing sequence as well as working memory. We are integrating, we are scaffolding, we are increasing skills. Can we have the next slide? Let's apply tracking, focusing, attention, finding to history now, other than just science. This is also from a middle school textbook, and as we know, middle school basal textbooks will give you terms at the beginning of a chapter section. They'll be bolded within the section, and they're easy to find. That's not what we're after here. We're looking for important terms, important words that students need to know. So could we have the next slide? The map. This is the map that goes along with the text portion. I have above visual tracking with a question mark. If students are weak in visual tracking, visual discrimination, paying attention, this is hard. Can we have the next slide? We're back to the texts. Now, I gave them and told them that they had to highlight the words of people's names, the tribes, and I added Rome and Roman to it. So now they are tracking and highlighting what they see. They are discriminating. They are paying attention. They are using working memory. That's great. What is it accomplishing in helping students construct their knowledge? We're told as educators that students should and must be able to construct their own knowledge. Let's look at the next slide, but with something different added. Whoops, can we go to the next one, Betsy or Sarah? There we go. Now, there's still color coding, but there's consistent color coding. So we can see West Goths are in purple, the words are in purple, and Roman or Rome in red. We can see the frequency and the proximity of the words next to each other. Clearly, the majority of the passage is about the West Goths and the Romans. Students are visually alerted to important information. They are creating a visual alert system. They are also categorizing information next to each other or graphically organizing it. This helps them, construct their knowledge and understand and find what's important within a text. Can we go back to the other slide? Now let's look at that map. For students who have a hard time reading maps, have them draw horizontal lines across the map. Now have them visually track as they did in the articles when they were reading. We are not only strengthening skills by applying them, we are transferring skills. So if you're familiar with Bloom, we learn content. We have to have an understanding. We have to apply. We have to have procedure. Once a student strengthens a skill, we have to, as educators, we have to transfer and apply. So here we're transferring and applying visual tracking. Can we go to the next map picture? There we go. Now the lines are fainter, and I apologize, my color coding is not too good. Don't tell my students, please. But what I tried to do was give Visigoths and Rome and the Ostrogoths colors and then track the pathway. This map is far easier to read and understand. Students can now connect what they read to the map they are seeing. Their ability to construct their knowledge, to learn, has greatly increased. Let's see. Can we have the next slide? All right. Visual, spatial, and whole part skills. The ability to transfer skills between subjects is a great struggle for many students. Nope, we've already settled that playing software strengthening games will not give a better essay. But we've also established that these skills are underlying academic performance. There's a reason why they're tested. If the skills weren't important, they wouldn't be tested. They're used in IEPs because they're important for academic progress of a student. So, spatial and whole part skills. let's transfer it. Can we have the next slide? Visual memory and pattern information are part of Visuospatial. They integrate together. Pattern information implies Visuospatial. In web weaving, remember, the dots light up, and then they are given the illustration without the dots lit, and they have to connect the dots to form a pattern. They have to remember. The next slide. Now we transfer it to literature. As educators, we're told we should have mentor texts. I have two, and we're going to go over both of them. Devil in the White City is the first one. Devil in the White City is an important text. It's used often in schools. The technology that is mentioned on this page was key to why Chicago got the World's Fair and could build museums such as what today is the Museum of Science and Industry. That technology is also what allowed the villain, the heinous doctor, to build his house of horrors. Therefore, the pages describing the technology are key. Web weaving, the game we just looked at, gives points of information one at a time. Then they have to be replicated to form a shape or pattern. I take this text. Could we have the next slide, please? And I break it down line by line. So this sentence reads, on top of this, workers would set down a layer of steel rails stretching from one end of the pad to the other. All right? Draw those words for me. Connect those words and create a picture. But here's what's critical. Earlier in the text, could we go back, Sarah, to the other screen? Let's see. It says that Root envisioned digging down to the first reasonable firm layer of clay known as hardpan, and there spreading a pad of concrete nearly 2 feet thick. Therefore, the screen that we just looked at that says, on top of this, workers would set down a layer of steel rails stretching from one end of the pad to the other, makes no sense if they don't understand the preceding words. They have to get it that under the dirt of Chicago is clay. It's not solid bedrock. So this was a problem for technology for construction in Chicago. This solution is critical to the text and the building of the World's Fair, which is in part what Devil in the White City is about. Practicing web weaving helps take points of a text, lines of a text, words of a text that have to be connected to create a picture from the words. Can we have the next slide, please? And the next one. So, web weaving is important. Somebody could argue and say, well, we can use logic like we teach our students to use to refute in a thesis-driven essay. Well, really, that literature passage, that Devil in the White City, was sort of like the history, sort of like the bone structure, especially the bone structure. How are we transferring? How are we strengthening? How are we expanding skills? Remember, all of those skills are underlying. Can we have the next slide? I said I had my mentor texts, and one was Devil in the White City. This is Haji Murad from Tolstoy. This is the very beginning, and I love these lines. They're fabulous. Web weaving helps students find patterns within a text. We know that in literature, students often have a problem discerning when the pattern of words changes, and that changing in the pattern of words is important. Can we have the next slide? Here, I'm not showing the tracking yet, again, or the pointing again. Students do that. What I have them do, though, now is highlight again in a consistent color any personal reference, so the words such as I, our, my, their, they, have to be highlighted. This in itself means nothing. It's practicing tracking, visual attention, visual discrimination. It's working on working memory, but it's not really helping them find a pattern, so to speak. Can we have the next slide? Now, have them connect the dots, just like they do in web weaving. And what do we find? We find an incredible zigzag shape there. And within that zigzag shape, the reader is alerted, something changed here. There's something different. Now, I didn't go through the remaining pages of Haji Murad, but if I did, or if you do, or your students do, they can create the same. This text is great. It can be used for a number of reasons. The lines 1 through 7 are so beautifully written, and the implicit thematic information that is embedded is in itself an entire lesson plan, maybe of 2 or 3 days if students struggle. But nevertheless, what I want you to see here and realize is our students, many of them, have problems with skills, fundamental skills. It is through valid, reliable, skill-building games such as Brainware Safari that they strengthen those skills. Strengthening the skills are great, but we, as educators, have to transfer and apply them. And when we do, we get students who excel, who leap through hoops, who are so excited, so motivated, so pleased with themselves, those intrinsic rewards that we can never replace or we can never give them. They have to accomplish it. They have to construct their knowledge. That's what we're helping them do via application. The next slide. So, the key to learning is skill strengthening and consistent application across disciplines. I cannot stress enough that nope, there's no game out there that's going to create an essay. But if we can do what we can to strengthen our students' skills and help them apply across disciplines, we are being educators that truly teach and scaffold our students. So this went a little faster than I thought, and I hope you have some questions, or we can go back and look at some slides if you'd like.
This is Betsy. It looks like she hit the off button instead of unmute, so she'll be back in just a minute. You didn't want to do that. I know that she had pulled questions that people had when they filled out the form, and I'm sure that she'll come back online and see if there's anything there. I don't see any questions from anyone yet in the chat. Those of you that are listening, if you have a specific question, you can feel free to type it into the chat, and then you'll be able to ask that question. Hi, Betsy. Welcome back.
That time I did push the wrong button. My mute button is right next to my off button on my phone. And so obviously my skills of visual tracking are not good this afternoon.
That's sky scanning for you.
Yeah, I need to phone up on my sky scanning. So that's exactly what I was going to say. I forgot to announce also at the beginning that we are recording this afternoon, as we typically do. I don't know if anybody's asked that question, but we always do that and are today. And the other thing is that we will be able to provide a copy of the slides that Stacy used. I think particularly since some of them are so graphically eloquent and sort of explaining the procedures and the suggestions that she had, that many of us will find them useful. And then I was going to say, I think what Sarah just said, which is hopefully we can might have a few questions and either open the lines up or have people chat, type them into the chat window. So
we have one that just came up from Dorothy, who's listening. She wants to know, what is the value of the zigzag shape in connecting the pronouns?
Can we go back to that slide?
I'm working on it. Let me see if I can do this. There we go.
All right, Dorothy. So in literature, students have often a hard time finding thematic information or just finding when patterns of information change. So if we look at the first 7 lines, the only personal reference, I, is the first letter. Now, within those 7 lines are gorgeously embedded implicit themes. Let's see, where is it? So, pink-tinged blossoms, cornflowers bright blue in the sunshine, and while still young, but growing paler and redder towards evening or when growing old, and delicate, quickly withering almond. Well, I don't know if you're familiar with Haji Murad or not, but this is struggle, this is survival, it is eventual death for Haji. If we go down now from lines 8 through the end, it's now talking about a particular flower, where above it's talking about many flowers. And they call this flower tartar, my nosegay, I climbed, I set to work, I wiped my hand, I felt sorry, I threw it away. And this is basically foretelling the whole book. Not the whole book, but certainly the end of the book. These themes are incredible, embedded in here. And they're more explicit than above. I set to work to pluck the flower, but this proved a very difficult task. It no longer seemed so fresh and beautiful. I destroyed it. I threw it away. Those words are within the zigzag shape. Now, you could say, anyone could say, oh, well, this is an exaggeration. Okay, it might be that we all have our different styles of teaching. We all have the same end goal. But what this does is alert students to that there are changes of patterns within an author's writing, within a text. That change may or may not be important, and this goes back to step 1, that salient information of inference. But if we can't find it, how do we know if it's important or not? So the ability to find is critical. And what this does is help students find. Dorothy, I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, I was just, Stacy, this is Betsy. I just wanted to add, when you and I were working on this, the initial sort of thing that struck me was simply that that first section is really all about the landscape, and that then it becomes a very internal, and you see that so clearly when you see all of the I's and me's and ours and those kinds of things. So that was one thing that this sort of accomplished to me, is that you do see that it going from a very external, I'm walking through the fields and it's a beautiful day, and then it becomes something about what that individual is experiencing. Is that a fair?
Absolutely. I think that's very good. You can also, so for my high school students, I will ask them in line 8 through the end to find words that are implicit for themes and to highlight those. So there are a number of ways of doing this, and again, I think it all comes down to our style of teaching and what our lesson plan is, and what we want our students to take away. And so as we want our students to transfer, to adapt, to apply, I'm suggesting ways that you can help your students, but again, I cannot stress enough, as educators, we all have our own styles. And key is to take valid, reliable neuroscience research and apply it to our needs within the classroom and our students' needs. Is there another question?
Dorothy said thank you. It was helpful to see how you used it, and it clarified whether the spacing was relevant or what she should be looking for. So she said thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy.
So far, no one else has come in with any questions. Betsy, were you able to pull any from the?
Yep, I did. In fact, so when people were registering, we got, as usual, a fascinating array of questions. And so, Stacy, one person asked whether sort of different levels of visual processing disabilities that might be present, and do you have to be at some certain functioning level to see improvement and advancement? Is this something that, if you're not at a certain level, you just can't progress, or do you see more improvement with different levels of processing deficits?
So there are different levels, and if you've ever seen a diagnostic evaluation, there are scales, percentages that are given, and they do quantify the levels via those numbers. Now, I'm not sure I understood, Betsy. Is the question, can they improve, or do the different, if a level is more severe, does that mean there's less progress?
I think that was it. It says, does the disability have to be at a certain functioning level to continue to see improvement and advancement?
So let me say this, that all our brains are plastic. I think we all know what plasticity is, and we know more and more now of adult brains, of examples of plasticity in adult brains. So I will say that the severity level in and by itself of visual processing doesn't really matter progress. Progress can absolutely be made. There's no two ways about it, and very good progress can be made. Let me stress that. Rarely, though, do we see one learning weakness. We see many together. So it in part depends then on the other weaknesses, if they exist, what they are, and are those being strengthened as well. What's also key is that there are many visual processing worksheets out there that you can access that truly, truly help visual processing in students. Key is the consistency and the repetition. So when students come to me and let's say they're dyslexic and their reading abilities are very, I hate to use the word poor, but let's say the evaluated grade level is a few years behind their grade level in school, that student definitely needs more work. More work means more frequency with consistent repetition. So for that student, 3 times a week, even if it's 40 minutes, is key. But then practicing tracking at home. The teachers being aware of, allow this student to track, allow this student to circle keywords, allow this student to color code in class. Those are all aspects that sometimes we don't have control over. So the bottom line is the severity doesn't matter if there aren't other severe weaknesses going on that are left untreated. Absolutely, we see gains. it's frequency, consistency, and repetition that gives the best gains, and the younger the student, the more easily the gains are made, as long as we have frequency, consistency, repetition.
Another question, Stacy, came from a homeschool teacher, homeschool parent, who was a public school teacher for a number of years before raising her family. And she was wondering whether there are, obviously, the kinds of things you've shown could certainly be applied in a home school or a one-on-one small group environment. Are there anything that you would adjust or change, or any specific recommendations you might have for a homeschooling parent? I know we had a number signed up for today.
I would say that when I take students and I group them together, so I'm going to first, I'll try and address the question, but first I'll address groups. Mm-hmm. You want students that are at the same level, if you can. Students working together, reciprocal teaching is fabulous. Often what I'll have students do is, when I have groups, is they exchange papers and they have to evaluate each other's paper. It doesn't mean I don't look at it. I'm looking at everything. But what's key is, for these students who have weaknesses, that makes them aware of another student's weakness, which makes them aware. But if they aren't at the same level, you have difficulties. Of course, you want to try and keep personalities the same if you can, because what creates a community of learning is motivation, acceptance, security, reciprocal teaching. There are so many aspects that go in. Now, can you apply this at home with any text? Absolutely. But there are some students, I want to stress, that don't need to track. They have good visual tracking. So just because we might have weak visual spatial skills in a student doesn't mean that tracking is weak. So when I referred to early on the diagnostic evaluations, the standardized tests that are used, there are subsets. And the subset will give, if you will, a tracking score, a discrimination score. It will give a sequence score. It'll do it for visual, and it'll do it for auditory skills as well. So targeting the weakness is key. If you don't know a weakness, but you suspect a student is weak, something like Brainware Safari is fabulous. If you find a student gets to a point in Brainware Safari and they get frustrated, then try some of these applications. Let them practice. Let it get reinforced. Practice, practice, practice is key. Practice in the sense practice isn't key. Let me preface that. Practice with correct procedure is key. That brings me to something that I couldn't find a good picture of. You saw the slide of the brain with the dorsal and ventral pathways for where and what. There's also a pathway for how. How doesn't necessarily refer to motor functions. How refers to the how-to. So practice of procedure, the how-to, is critical. Even more critical is when students are frustrating. Thank you, I see the slide up. Is teaching them the how-to. So if they get frustrated at a certain point in Brainware Safari, you may have to teach them how to accomplish and apply it to academics, and then let them go back and practice the game again. We know we can have frustration level, instructional level, and independence level. We never want frustrational level.
That's a very interesting point, Stacy, about helping students connect the games, which is how they typically refer to them in Brainware Safari, to the actual academic challenges that they're facing, and that could actually help reinforce and motivate them to persist through some of those challenges, and that also, while they're developing them, is going to strengthen, of course, their ability to, to track and to determine patterns and all the other kinds of things you were talking about.
Absolutely.
Okay. Another question that came up, and I think you've sort of already referred to this, but it's one of my favorite kinds of questions because there are so many different ways to approach an answer to it. The question was about how much of working intelligence, and it may have been that this person really was referring to working memory, although working memory and fluid intelligence are so highly connected that I don't know that it really matters, but how much is nature and how much is learned? There's a for you.
All right, so I love these questions, that good old nature-nurture debate. So we used to hear that nature set the boundaries and nurture set the mark. Well, we know now, and years and years ago, they came out with a study, one of the first ones, that showed that monks' brains who lived in a monastery, spent a great deal of time meditating, actually changed their brain structure. The functioning of their brain changed. We know that, years ago, over 10 years ago now, I went to a brain and learning conference, and there was a professor from MIT who was talking, who was really on the cutting edge then of consistent repetition and how at the synaptic junction level, and I think we're all familiar with these words now, the firing frequency increased, the threshold for firing decreased, and the duration of firing, it lasted longer. And an audience member, and of course the researcher was applying this to education and referring to consistent repetition within education. And an educator got up and just said, almost yelled, "And soon you'll be telling us teachers aren't necessary." Now I thought it was fascinating because it reinforced what Eric Kandel had found. So, I'm not the expert in nature-nurture. I don't want to believe that we cannot increase skill levels of students because simply I know we can. So I can't say that. But I will say that if there is neurological damage, that's different. But if we're talking about students who have weak skills, so often they would say the learning styles, and I remember being at a parent conference with teachers. It was at the school, actually, so this was not educational. This was at my children's school. And one of the parents said, "Well, my student is a fabulous visual learner. You should be doing everything visual." And nothing the teachers or staff could say made that parent happy. And I raised my hand and said, "But what are your students' auditory skills like?" Because our brains compensate. So if we are weak in auditory skills, we will use visual skills more to help us process, receive, process, and reflectively think with purpose about information. Now that doesn't mean those skills can't be increased, the weak skills. Absolutely they can. So then the nature-nurture, working memory can start out very weak. I see it all the time. And I will say this, that my students who come to me with weak working memory have the hardest time initially. More than anything, you need to increase working memory, and we can do it, and it's really not that hard to do. You can email me. It's really not. It takes time, and it takes consistent repetition, but we can absolutely increase working memory. If we don't do that first, that poor child is absolutely exhausted, bombarded, overwhelmed, and shuts down. So I know I gave a long answer here, but I can't believe in nature-nurture for working memory because I see it increase. Now, can we go from a 10% level working memory to 100% level working of memory? I'm not going to say that. But I will say, because I've seen it done, I've done it, where students are at a 20% level and they go to a 30 and then a 40 and then a 50. And at some point, the parents or student will say, hey, I'm doing great, I don't need it anymore, because they're really happy with 60% score of working memory. So I hope that answers your question. That's a tough one.
Yeah, that is, but we like to give you tough questions too. And so we've run up against our deadline. I just want to thank you again, Stacy, so much, and I want to thank everybody who was able to participate this afternoon. We, again, will be sending some more information out. Some of the questions about the skills that were being developed, I see there were a few more that came up, and there's some very interesting research that we have done specifically that relates to working memory and some of the other kinds of skills that Stacy was referring to. So we will include that as well. So Stacy, thank you so much for being part of this today, and we hope to see everybody at another Neuroscience and Education webinar. We actually have one 2 weeks from today on in the Common Core Standards, and so we hope you'll be able to join us then or at another one in the near future. So much.
All right, thank you, everyone. And again, Betsy, thank you, and Sarah, for the invitation, and Sarah, your invaluable help.
Thanks a lot.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.